just to share a little bit about myself, I grew up in between Plattekill and Modena in the southeastern corner of Ulster County. Growing up, I always had a deep love of history. I graduated from Wallkill High School in 2016. I studied history at SUNY New Paltz, and truth be told, I didn't major or study local history. I was an Irish history major, if you could believe that. And I planned on living in Ireland. I planned on applying to grad school in Ireland. I studied abroad there my last semester. But I had the great fortune of graduating college in the spring of 2020, meaning I was kicked out of Ireland as I was working on my grad school applications, and I ended up back here. And I was very fortunate to get a job full-time at Historic Huguenot Street, where I had worked part-time as a tour guide in college. And in my time at Huguenot Street, I really carried the torch forward, a torch that had been lit by my predecessors, to really expand the interpretation there at Huguenot Street, to tell a broader story of the history of New Paltz and of that historic site, to include not just the European men and women who lived on that site, but to, in a way that was equally central to the story, talk about the enslaved people who lived there, talk about the free people of color who lived in New Paltz historically, as well as the native population there. And so as I've been blessed to work for the last 2 years as the Ulster County Historian, I've been able to carry kind of that mission forward to the county as a whole. And so today's presentation, titled The Names We Know, Jack and Betty, the first known African residents of New Paltz, is going to be about the earliest recorded African people, Black Americans, to live in New Paltz, New York. We can't definitively say they're the first Black people to live in New Paltz, but they are the earliest people on record. Now, one just overarching fact I want to share with you guys to start, a bit of context, is that, what we know about the past, what we do as historians, is we study primary source documents. We study records that survive. And many times, more documents from the past survive than you might expect. I work in the Ulster County Archives in Kingston, where we have documents from our county's government going all the way back to the 1650s. And yet, those documents, they aren't going to shine equal light on every different kind of person who was living here. And so there's an inequality inherent to the historical record. If Europeans are the ones who are primarily creating documents, any mention of enslaved person is most likely going to be a mention from a European. And so they're going to be less often appearing in documents, enslaved people, than Europeans. When they are, it's often in a dehumanizing light, or in the very least in a light that doesn't give us a full picture of that person's humanity, of their experience in life. So in one sense, I want to be talking you guys through the documents we have and the facts that they reveal about Jack and Betty and their experience in New Paltz, but we're also going to speculate a little bit. We're going to use contextual evidence to try and imagine what their life would have been like in a more humanizing, in a more holistic sense as well. And the painting you can see up there to start, just to give credit, is from a fantastically talented historical painter named Len Tantillo. How many of you guys have heard of Len Tantillo, just out of curiosity? A few people, yeah. He's actually from a family with deep, deep ties to this area. And what Len Tantillo does is he takes archaeological data, he takes primary source documents, and he reconstructs what a given site would have looked like at a specific point in time in incredible detail. And so this painting is a view of Huguenot Street. It's really a view of the earliest part of New Paltz, the earliest settlement in New Paltz, about 1685. But the two enslaved people, the two people of color in the bottom right of the image, that's meant to be a representation of Jack and Betty. And it's a good example of just what a fantastic researcher Len Tantillo is as well, that he found these documents for Jack and Betty, painted them into this picture. And we're going to come back to this painting in a little bit. But I'm going to share some context to get us started. How did I end up doing this research? And so for the last 3 years, going back to when I worked at Huguenot Street, we had been collaborating with an organization called the Witness Stones Project. And really this was a multi-organizational collaboration. It was a collaboration between Historic Huguenot Street, the Margaret Wade Lewis Center, which is the Black History and Cultural Organization in New Paltz, which I also work with and for, and now, since I've become Ulster County Historian, Ulster County as well. And just out of curiosity, how many of you guys, if anyone, has heard of the Witness Stones Project? I know a couple people have. Wonderful. How many of you guys have heard of Stoppelstein? A couple of people. So really, the Witness Stones Project was inspired by a European memorial initiative. Stoppelstein means stumbling stone in German. And if you see the two bricks on the right side of the screen, these are very similar to what Stoppelstein looked like. They're small stumbling stones. They're small bricks you're meant to stumble upon, just raised up from the ground. And they're placed in Europe in places where victims of the Holocaust lived or worked or we know were present. And they're meant for you to stumble upon and be reminded of that person's presence and be reminded of their experience. And with the blessing of the Stoppelstein Project, the Witness Stones Project took that initiative or that approach and applied it to the history of enslavement here. But as we set about to collaborate with the Witness Stones Project to put in memorials for enslaved people on Huguenot Street, we faced a bit of a logistical challenge. I remember my supervisor at Huguenot Street, Kara Augustine, in our first meeting with the Witness Stones Project, saying if we put in witness stones for every enslaved person in New Paltz, we'd cobble the streets of the town. A given town like New Paltz in 1790 in the first U.S. federal census had about 15% of the population being enslaved Africans. In 1790, there are well over 2,000 enslaved African people in Ulster County. And the Witness Stones Project originated in New England, where there tended to be fewer enslaved people per site and per community. And so to get around this logistical challenge, we decided to begin first 3 years ago by researching the earliest recorded enslaved people associated with the founders of New Paltz. Their names were Anthony and Susanna, and you can see the witness stones for them there. Those have since been placed on Huguenot Street. Anthony and Susanna were purchased by one of the European founders of New Paltz, a man named Louis Du Bois, when he was still living in Kingston, years before New Paltz was founded. And it's a fantastic reminder of how no kind of dehumanization, no legal reduction of the status of a human being can truly take away their humanity or their desire to be free. Anthony and Susanna, they self-emancipated from Louis Du Bois, and they never returned. They didn't come back before New Paltz was founded. And so the next year, really this was 2 years ago now, we researched the earliest recorded enslaved people we knew to have lived in New Paltz, and their names were Jack and Betty. And in the time since, there are witness stones that have been placed for Jack and Betty on Huguenot Street as well. And I encourage you guys to visit Huguenot Street to check out those witness stones and to read. We have a interpretive sign that talks about their story in a little bit more depth. And just quickly to mention the sources for this research. Really, this was research that was kind of catalyzed by a archival project that's taken place in New Paltz in recent years. And I'm mentioning this really to encourage all of you guys to check out this digitized archival collection. The page on the right is from a website called nyheritage.org. And it's an incredible website where historic sites, museums, repositories all over New York State have been digitizing their archival materials and have been putting them for free on this website with all kinds of contextual data, making it accessible for people just like you guys to go on that website, view documents yourselves, and do research yourselves, really making history more accessible to the public. And it was really from a collaboration between the Elting Memorial Library in New Paltz, the town of New Paltz, the New Paltz Reformed Church, and Historic Huguenot Street that I was able to do this research. They collaborated over the last really 3 or 4 years to digitize almost every historic document from New Paltz. Right now I know they're up to about 1810 at the very least. Thousands and thousands of pages of historic documents have been digitized and translated on this website. And that means researching two people like Jack and Betty, previously a person in my position would have had to go into an archive, go through boxes and boxes of archival materials. And even harder, they would have had to be able to speak Dutch to figure out if those archival documents even mentioned Jack and Betty. And with a project like this and the translation work that went into it as well, I've been able to find documents mentioning Jack and Betty far quicker. We can conduct comparisons between different documents. We can share these documents with scholars across the country to get their feedback. We can get these documents translated by scholars, sometimes in the Netherlands itself. And so I really wanted to mention this, not just to give credit to the sources for this project, but to encourage you guys to check out this website, nyheritage.org. And so just some very, very, very quick context. I want to mention why New Paltz gets founded in the first place, and a bit about the human history of New Paltz going far back before the Huguenots ended up there in the 1670s. And so, I guess I could start here in a few different places, but Just out of curiosity, does anyone know what the name of the Native American tribe that lived here in the Hudson Valley was before European colonization? Go for it. The Esopus, yeah, that was the most specific answer possible too, so bravo, yeah. Usually people say Lenape first. Lenape is really a language. It's a cultural group, but a language primarily. And I can get bogged down in this, so I'm gonna try and go quick. I can give an hour presentation on this topic. But Lenape is a language as part of the Eastern Algonquian language family. And that language family actually developed 10,000 years ago or more in the Columbia River Basin in the northwest of the United States. And over thousands of years, speakers of this language family moved east across what's now the border of the US and Canada. And as they go, over thousands of years, they leave groups behind. And each of those groups behind has their own kind of flavor of this language family. And they become branches on this tree of related languages. And sometime in the last 2,000 to 4,000 years, a group of Eastern Algonquian speakers came down from the Great Lakes region and began to inhabit the Hudson River Valley. Really, they inhabited a region stretching from the Housatonic River Valley, a bit into the Connecticut River Valley, west across the Hudson Valley, across the upper branches of the Delaware River Valley, to the upper branches of the Susquehanna River. And these individuals spoke a branch of the Algonquian language family called Lenape, but really we call it Lenape today. Lenape in their language means, does anyone know what Lenape means in their language? It means person. So imagine the first Dutch explorers come here. Henry Hudson comes right up this river in 1609. He meets these people. He says, "Who are you?" They say, "I don't know, we're people." And we call them Lenape ever since. Have any of you guys heard the term Lenni Lenape before? So Lenni Lenape was their way, it is their way of specifying themselves. It means the first people, the original people. And they would have had a different word preceding Lenape for Europeans, and a different word preceding Lenape for African peoples as well. And Lenape peoples, they lived in subgroups, really identifying most closely with the land they lived on. And sometime around the time of colonization, the subgroup living here in what's now Ulster County, their boundaries were very close to our county boundaries today. They stretched from about 2/3 of the way up the Catskill Mountains, about what's now the boundary between Ulster and Greene counties, down to about what's now the city of Newburgh, west into just up until you get to the upper branches of the Delaware River. And this group came to be known as the Esopus people. And the Esopus people we know have lived here for at least 2,000 years. We know Native people in general have lived here thousands of years longer. The oldest archaeological evidence we have of native habitation here stretches back to about 12 to 14,000 years ago. And just to give you a sense of how long ago that was, one of the oldest inhabited sites we know of is Kingston Point Park in Kingston. And it was a beach over water, just like it is today. But it wasn't a beach over a river. It was a beach over a post-glacial lake that stretched from Albany almost all the way down to New York City. So giving you a sense of just how different this landscape could be over thousands of years. But in the last 2,000 years, the Lenape people, specifically the Esopus, lived here and stewarded this landscape, with the way of life really built around the environment. And I show this picture on the left, this picture I took in New Paltz about 2 years ago, because this is the reason people lived here. This is the reason Native people lived here, this is the reason Europeans decided to settle here. It's not the Hudson River, so much as it's the inland tributaries of the Hudson, and the floodplains on those inland tributaries. If you think about the oldest European settlements here, places like Hurley, places like Kingston, places like New Paltz, all of them are on a very similar topographic layout. They're on a raised, flat piece of ground that's well drained up above a fertile floodplain of a tributary of the Hudson. And those floodplains would be farmed because of the fertile agricultural value of the land, the deposits left behind by these seasonal floods. Meanwhile, the homes of the Esopus people would be on those raised grounds, safe from the floods, well drained as well, so they could dig storage pits to store their food. And so we might not think of ourselves as, our way of life dictated by the environment. And yet when you think about a place like New Paltz, the village still has only expanded beyond Huguenot Street to the north, the south, and the east. And we have never expanded onto that floodplain. Just as the Native people farm that land, we farm that land today. We actually farm it with plants like corn and sunflowers that have likely been grown in that same spot for 2,000 years or more. And so there's a lot of continuity, I think, with human history on this landscape. And so here on the left, you have an image of the Esopus dwelling, really the Lenape type of dwelling. This is a wigwam. Wigwams were really lived in by Algonquian peoples in general. And in Algonquian, wigwam just means home. But I always like to show this wigwam because this one is on Huguenot Street. It was reconstructed in 2017. It's a replica, but it's a replica made entirely out of native plant materials, and it was reconstructed on the exact site of a wigwam that we know stood there sometime in the early 17th or the 16th centuries. Where the Senate House is in uptown Kingston, we have found foundations of a wigwam underneath the floorboards of that building. Where Old Hurley is, there have been longhouses and wigwam foundations found. So Europeans, when they arrive here, they're not coming into a virgin wilderness. They are building their homes on top of former village sites, and they're utilizing an environment, perfect for agriculture, that had been created and stewarded by native peoples. And the map on the right shows you a number of the other Lenape-speaking subgroups of our region. I'd be remiss not to mention the Esopus' neighbors just across the Hudson, the Wappingers people, and in general, I should also mention there were 3 dialects of Lenape that were spoken. There is the dialect spoken here on the west side of the Hudson, a bit on the east side as well. The Wappingers spoke the same dialect as the Esopus. That's called Munsee. The Munsee people today reside in 3 federally recognized nations in Ontario, Canada: the Munsee-Delaware Nation, the Delaware Nation at Moraviantown, and the 6 Nations of the Grand River, which is a Haudenosaunee community, but there's a group of people living there called the Delaware of the 6 Nations, and they are the most direct descendants of the Esopus people here in their government. There is a dialect spoken on the east side and up in the northern Catskill Mountains as well, and that was called Mohican. And Mohican peoples today, as well as some Munsee descendants, reside in the Stockbridge-Munsee Band of Mohican Indians in Wisconsin. And then the southernmost dialect, spoken in New Jersey, in northern Delaware, and Pennsylvania, was called Unami. And the Unami peoples today reside on federally recognized communities in Oklahoma. And they are the Delaware Tribe of Indians and the Delaware Nation there. And this context is so important because Jack and Betty, they arrive into the time period in which settlements are just starting, European colonial settlements are just starting to expand outward from what we would now call Kingston. Colonization begins here really with New York City and Albany in the 1620s. And that's motivated by trade with native peoples for valuable furs which could be brought back to Europe. By settling in New York City, they can export those furs. By settling in Albany, you can trade both with the Lenape people and with the other native group here in New York, the Haudenosaunee people in western New York in the Mohawk Valley. And I always make sure to mention that that Haudenosaunee and Lenape, those languages are as different from one another as they are from English. And that's a testament to the diversity of native peoples as well. And so they try and coexist, believe it or not, when Europeans first come here to the Mid-Hudson Valley. What we now call Kingston is first settled in 1652 after a man who is sick of living under colonial authority in Albany, wants a bit more autonomy, purchases land along the Esopus Creek from an Esopus man. And at first, by 1657, there's 12 or so families living there, but they're living right up against the Esopus people. And tensions start to rise immediately. Tensions grow over things like cultural misunderstandings. The Europeans didn't pen their livestock, and it'd be common to find a European pig with an arrow in its side dead in a Lenape maize field after that livestock had been destroying a Lenape crop field. You have cultural misunderstandings over alcohol. You have cultural misunderstandings over different economic systems of trade. Of course, Europeans are encroaching on their land. Disease is taking its toll on their population. And, I have to be careful not to get bogged down in this, but the Lenape way of life is built around the environment. If you disrupt that environment, you disrupt that way of life. And that's what happens here. And as more and more Europeans arrive, it makes it harder and harder for the Esopus people to live their traditional way of life here. And eventually, 2 wars were fought in this region. Actually, what we now call the Stockade area of Kingston was established in 1658 because of these tensions. Governor Peter Stuyvesant ordered the residents of Kingston to concentrate their homes behind a wooden palisade for protection in case war broke out, and war did break out. And I'm not going to get bogged down in the details of those wars, but what's important for us is that these 2 wars from 1659 to 1663, they are incredibly destructive on both sides. Both sides are trying to exterminate the other and are using language of extermination. Both sides are not just killing combatants, they're killing non-combatants. There's food stores destroyed before winter, there are homes destroyed before winter. And when these wars end in 1664, something incredible happens. These 2 sides don't just say we're not going to fight anymore. They flip that relationship on its head, They sign a peace treaty right after the English take over this colony from the Dutch in 1665. And in this peace treaty, the Nicholas Treaty, which we still have in the Ulster County archives, they commit themselves to living in peace and supporting one another in perpetuity. And they say, we're going to renew this treaty every year, and our kids are going to come to the renewal so that they can carry this legacy forward. And those treaty renewals, this alliance is upkept from 1665 until 1776. And it doesn't break until the American Revolution. And the Esopus people end up choosing the opposite side in the Revolution, and it's that conflict that leads to their forced removal to Ontario. But so New Paltz is one of the first communities founded in the aftermath of those wars. And the Esopus people are still here. They're still wielding immense power and stewarding this land. But they make a difficult decision in the face of tough circumstances. It's a strategy. They are not helpless victims forced to sell their land. They strategize. And they sell their land in small pieces, one little portion at a time, and over 60 land deeds between 1660 and 1760. And these land sales would help sustain their peoples in these difficult circumstances. They would move elsewhere to unceded land to live alongside their family members and neighbors. But they are forced to sell this land to keep their people alive. In the case of New Paltz, New Paltz was sold for something like 60 axes, 60 adzes, linen clothing, wool blankets, pots and pans, raw materials like bars of lead, gunpowder, guns, wine, wampum, and so on and so forth. Horses as well, geldings, but horses as well. And these goods are important in sustaining their peoples. And also, by selling it in small portions, they maintain access in this area. In the case of the New Paltz land agreement, they retain the right to hunt here freely, to fish here freely, to travel through this landscape freely. But it's really that land sale, which is signed with 12 French-speaking men that are traditionally called Huguenots. They refer to themselves as Walloons. They really were from what we now call modern-day Belgium. But those 12 men from 7 different French-speaking families, they purchased 40,000 acres from the Esopus people in April of 1677. That land sale is confirmed in September of 1677, and in the spring of 1678, they're given permission by the English government to move down to New Paltz and begin building homes on what's now Huguenot Street. And so this slide kind of shows you the before and after of that process. We have a painting on the left by a staff member at Huguenot Street, Josephine Bloodgood, showing a wigwam on Huguenot Street. In the bottom right, you have Len Tantillo's painting of what the earliest phase of the European and African settlement in New Paltz would look like. And in the top right, you have an image of the New Paltz land agreement, a copy of which still survives in Historic Huguenot Street's archives. And so there's that same painting zoomed in just a little bit. And this document here, this comes about 2 years after New Paltz is first settled by Europeans. We cannot say definitively that an African person was alongside those Europeans the first time they stepped foot on this land, but there's every chance there were. We just don't have a document telling us for certain one way or the other. And so this is not necessarily the earliest record, this is not necessarily the first African person to live in New Paltz. This is the earliest record we have surviving of an African person living in New Paltz. And this is a bill of sale from July 5th, 1680. Does anyone notice anything about that document itself? Does it look like it's from the 1600s? Look at that land agreement in the top left, or top right there. Compare that document with this one. And this is itself an example of the inequality inherent to the historical record. We do not have the original document that this is a translation or transcription of. We don't know where it is. But thank God we have this transcription and this translation. I'll read just a portion to you. It says, Mr. Hartman Wessels, a resident physician who says that he has sold and handed over to the behalf of Pierre Deyo, one of the European founders of New Paltz, living in the Esopus in the New Paltz, a certain Negro man named Jack, and this for the sum of 1,160 Dutch guilders. Now this document tells us that Jack was sold from a physician in New York City. From that, you can imagine we can try and look further into that physician in New York City. We can try and learn more about his experiences. But at the same time, this document doesn't tell us much. It doesn't tell us if Jack was his birth name or the name that he would have chosen for himself. It doesn't tell us where Jack's from. It doesn't tell us if Jack was born into enslavement here or in the Caribbean before being relocated to New York, or if he was born in Africa and was forcibly trafficked here into enslavement. It doesn't tell us anything about where his family or his loved ones are. It doesn't tell us his age. It doesn't tell us anything about his skills. It doesn't tell us anything about his ethnic background. What community in Africa was he from? What language did he speak? What did Jack like to do? Right? What habits did Jack have? How did Jack sound like? And yet it does something powerful at the same time in that it tells us he was there in New Paltz. In the earliest years, when the earliest homes would be being constructed there, when the first roads are being laid out, when the first crop fields are being plowed and planted, when the foundation for the success of this community that I call home to this day is laid out. And for that reason, I think it's important we think about people like Jack, not just as the first recorded African residents of a town, but as founders of these communities in our area. Now, because we know who Jack was sold by, we can look further into that individual and glean some more details about his life. Yeah, Joan, go for it. Yeah. That's a good question. And that's a historian's phrasing right there, because I noticed you didn't ask how much is it worth today, which is an incredibly difficult question to answer and one we can't really answer. But perfect question. Well, how does that compare to other items' value of that time period? And in another sense, these documents, and I should mention this right off the bat, these documents are going to very viscerally reveal to us the treatment of enslaved Africans in that time period by Europeans. These are documents that are going to reflect the dehumanization inherent to enslavement here. These are human beings that legally were reduced to the status of chattel, of property, of livestock. And they're going to reveal to us the racialization inherent to enslavement here as well. Does this document say slave? No. They use a word for African, and that was enough to specify what they meant. And it's that combination of factors, racialization and chattel enslavement, that is really what makes enslavement here in North and South America pretty unique in human history, as it was practiced in the last 400 or 500 years. Now, this is a document that was found in the abstracts of wills on file in the surrogate's office in the city of New York. And I'll read it out to you. It says, Augustine Blydenborg, plaintiff against Hartman Wessels. This is a transcript, of course. Surgeon. He demands 450 guilders of suent or wampum due May 23rd, 1678, for the rent of his new house, lying westward of his own dwelling house, for 3 years, ending May 23rd, 1681. And a rent of 600 a rent of 600 guilders wampum, payable quarterly in merchantable whole beavers, or whole beavers by the weight at 9 shillings per pound, or wampum for half. And it says, the man Wessels has occupied this house for 1 year and 3 quarters without paying for the same. This document comes from May 23rd, or comes from 1677, 1678. We don't have the exact date on when this took place. But this is telling us a possible motive for why Jack might have been sold. His first enslaver, at least his enslaver prior to his coming to New Paltz, was in deep, deep debt over unpaid rent. And I mean, being in deep debt, he sells Jack not long afterward. Enslaved people are, in this dehumanizing status, they are valuable commodities to Europeans at that time period. They're treated that way. And it's a possible motivation for why Jack might have been sold here in the first place, is that debt. But it also, to answer Joan's question, gives us a sense of the value of an enslaved person, right? So if he is paying 600 guilders quarterly for his rent, right? That's about 2,400 guilders per year that he's paying for a house in New York City. And so if Jack is sold for 1,100 guilders, that's about half a year's rent in that time period, which gives you a sense of that value. This also tells us some other things, right? It tells us that Jack lived in a physician's household previously. We don't know this for certain, but imagine what he might have heard there. Imagine what he might have seen there. I mean, imagine the skills Jack might have learned there. It's very possible he had the skills of a physician. It's very possible he knew certain medical treatments. It's very possible that he would have been carrying those same skills forward in his time in New Paltz as well. And think about how valuable those skills would be to a community just forming on what was then a frontier in the 1670s. It also tells us where he lived. You'll see the editor's note on the bottom says the above house is probably number 28 Stone Street. Now the numbers, I don't know where this editor got that number from, and I don't know how we could possibly determine that, but we know where Stone Street is and we know what it looks like. Have any of you guys been there before? It's in southern Manhattan. It's about a block away from Fraunces Tavern, if you've ever been there. It's a very famous historic landmark. And you can see the image on the right. That's not at all what it would have looked like when Jack was living there, but it's still a very historic looking area of Manhattan. And at least gives us a sense of where Jack was living. But I, at the same time, think about how different this place would have been for Jack. Living in a place like New York City meant that even if Hartman Wessels didn't enslave anyone else, Jack was living alongside other African peoples. He would have known other African peoples. He would have possibly been around his own family there, or loved ones, or at least a community. And I can only imagine what it would have been like for him coming here to this area, when there are so few towns here, and especially coming to a place like New Paltz, where they spoke French. And there's every chance that he might not have even been able to communicate with the enslavers he had when he arrived here. But again, it gives us at least a little bit more whole view of Jack's experience. This is an image of the will of Christian Deyo. Christian Deyo dies a few years after Jack is purchased in 1680. And when Christian Deyo passes away, he leaves his property, all of it, equally divided among his children. He doesn't specify Jack in the will. He does not say what's going to happen to Jack. He leaves all his property equally divided. And a visceral demonstration, again, of the dehumanization inherent to enslavement. We see a human being partially owned by multiple heirs of Christian Deyo in this aftermath. This is the second and the only other document that exists that we found currently that mentions Jack. This is from May 13th, 1689. And this is a document, really a receipt, between Christian Deyo's son Pierre Deyo and his son-in-law Abraham Du Bois. And I'll mention these are also both founders of New Paltz who signed the founding land agreement there. And it says, I, the undersigned Abraham Du Bois, laborer, living in New Paltz, certify that I received from Pierre Deyo 55 bushels of wheat, that he owed me for my part of the Negro I inherited from my father-in-law, Christian Deyo, for which I consider him cleared a debt to me at the Paltz, May 13th, 1689. So this tells us that Jack was at first, it's a bit of an educated guess, guessing that this is mentioning Jack. You can see his name is not even used in this document. But I believe this document tells us that Jack was first co-owned, inherited by Christian Deyo's children before Pierre Deyo, Christian Deyo's son, purchased the rights from his siblings. And so Jack was then enslaved by Pierre Deyo. And although we don't have a document telling us this, we can speculate a bit about what his life on Huguenot Street would have been like. On the right side there, how many of you guys have been to Huguenot Street before? Almost everyone, but a lot. So that is the Deyo Broadhead house on Huguenot Street. The stone portion you can see in the bottom left of that home, that is the second phase of the Deyo family's original home. It was largely destroyed and expanded into this Victorian mansion in the 1890s. But in the bottom left, you can see an archival photograph of what that house looked like before its Victorian expansion. And really before that stone house was built. We know now from tree ring dating that the stone houses on Huguenot Street, despite what those blue historic markers down there tell you, we know now that those houses were built usually by the second generation of residents there. And they first built wooden houses they lived in for a generation or so. And in the top left, you have a drawing by Len Tantillo of what those wooden houses, wattle and daub houses possibly, would have looked like. And I imagine that Jack very likely would have contributed to the construction of the first houses in New Paltz. His hands would have done the physical and hard work building the earliest homes there, keeping people warm and allowing them to survive. As I mentioned earlier, his hands probably plowed the first crop fields there that were feeding and sustaining that population. If those efforts aren't successful, I don't exist. I've lived my whole life in New Paltz. My family has lived in New Paltz for 11 generations now. I should have mentioned this earlier. I'm a direct descendant of Christian and Pierre Deyo. I would not exist if not for these impacts that Jack had in this early community. And that's why I think it's so important, even if we don't have a document telling us this, that we speculate as to what those impacts would have been, what his experience there would have been like. And that's all we know about Jack. We have 2 documents that attest to his existence in New Paltz. We'll move on to Betty and talk a bit about her. I'm just going to take a drink. Does anyone have any questions so far? I'll take a quick pause. Wonderful. So this is a translation of a letter from July 4th, 1694. It's an ironic date. And you'll see, just like the first document for Jack, this is a transcription, and we do not know where the original document is. And it says, assuming, well, on the top is a bit of an editor's note. I'm going to skip over that. It says, Peter Deyo, it really should have been Pierre Deyo, at New York, July 4th, 1694. So this is addressed to Pierre Deyo. It says, Sir, if you are really desirous of having the negress of whom you spoke to me, send 36 pistoles at the first opportunity. Otherwise, please let me know if you do not wish her, so that those to whom she now belongs may wait no longer. For as she is sold, they only await your pleasure for her delivery. I am your obedient servant, Charles. And we know now that that man's last name was Charles Denisot, or Denasaw. And I'm going to move forward just one more. About a month later, we have a receipt, and it's titled, Receipt for the Sale of Betty, an Enslaved Woman, Charles Denisot, for Pierre Deyo, by James Barré. And the translation of this document says, I, the undersigned, certify that I received from Mr. Charles Denisot the sum of 35 pistoles in current New York money for a little negress named Betty, whom I sold to Pierre Deyo of New Paltz, New York, August 3rd, 1694. So this comes about a month after. Can anyone figure out what's happening here? What's Charles Denisot's role in this? Say it louder.
Broker.
Yeah, he's a middleman. Many people expect that the earliest enslaved residents of our towns that expand outwards from New Paltz are enslaved people purchased at auctions outwards from Kingston, I meant to say, are enslaved people purchased at auctions in Kingston. And many times they were. Anthony and Susanna, the first people enslaved by the founders in New Paltz, were purchased at a public auction in Kingston. But historians traditionally presented New Paltz and Ulster County as a whole as a kind of rural backwater, completely separated from the rest of the colonial establishment. And I think that interpretation completely misses the point. This was founded as an economic venture, a place for people to live, but a place for people to make money and make money for others as well. And it was tied inherently to the economic system in New York City and to a transatlantic trade from its founding. I don't know if you guys noticed, but one of the commodities used in the purchase of Jack were bushels of wheat. That was really what was driving the economy here. And Jack would have been someone growing the wheat that was being exported en masse through New York City. And the wheat that was being grown here was being exported not to Europe to feed Europeans, it was being exported to the Caribbean. And it was feeding enslaved populations on sugar plantations in the Caribbean. And that's a large motivator, or a large factor in a place like New Paltz's economic success in its early generations. Enslavement on a broader scale, on an international scale as well. And so Charles Denisot is a middleman. And many of the first enslaved people here are not bought through Kingston, but are bought directly from New York City, through cultural ties, through economic ties. Charles Denisot was married to Pierre Deyo's cousin. And so Pierre Deyo's looking to purchase an enslaved woman. He likely contacts Charles Denisot. Charles Denisot finds a seller. He negotiates terms, and he writes back here to Pierre Deyo saying, if you accept these terms, deliver the payment and I will deliver Betty to you. And this tells us a few things. This tells us how Betty arrived here. She would have arrived just up this river. And she would have likely landed at the Strand in what's now downtown Kingston. And if not there, she would have landed at New Paltz Landing, originally, what they called then Highland Landing, just down here on the Hudson River, before being brought down to New Paltz, probably the Strand in Kingston now. And the seller sells Betty through Charles Denisot is a man named James Barré. James Barré was a human trafficker. James Barré was a slave trader. He made a large portion of his income by trafficking enslaved people to New Netherland for them to be sold. And he's responsible for introducing a large number of enslaved people to this colony in the 1660s. I'm going to ask one more question before I move on here. Does anyone notice the difference in the cost between the last document and this one? Charles Denisot's cut was 1 pistole. That's a Portuguese gold coin. You'll see here, 35 pistoles were given to James Barré, and it's 36 pistoles that Charles Denisot says has to be sold to him. He takes a 1 pistole as his cut for being the middleman in the sale of a human being. And we don't know, just like with Jack, a lot about Betty's early life. We don't know if Betty was born into enslavement here in the colony. We don't know if Betty was born into enslavement in the Caribbean and then brought here. We don't know if Betty was captured and trafficked from her home and separated from her loved ones. We don't know if she was alongside those loved ones when she was in New York City with James Barré and was separated when she was sent here. We don't know what African people Betty was from. We don't know how old she was, although the last document, the use of the word little gives us an indication. My guess would be that she was young. And we can imagine, just like with Jack, what that experience would have been like, especially for a young person. Not just being dehumanized, not just being forced to live and work here against their will, but being separated from the home, the community, the loved ones they would have known in a place like New York City, to a place that is not just geographically isolated, despite what I said before, to a place that is also culturally different from where she had come from previously. But I do know that, well, I shouldn't say no. I very strongly believe that Betty would have been trafficked here from her home. We can't say that for Jack, we don't know, but I believe Betty would have been. And that's because we have a couple other documents about James Barré. This is a document from the New York State Archives from 1679. You'll see it's torn, but it's titled Account of Indians Sold in New York by James Barré. And it's an account of Native Americans who were sold as enslaved people here. And it gives the names of the Native people, it also gives the names of their purchasers. But unfortunately, the names of the purchasers are the part that's ripped off. But the names of the enslaved people are names like Clara, Juan, Maria, Diego. We know from documents that survive in Mexico that James Barré was not just a trafficker, he was also a pirate. And James Barré, at this point in 1679, the preceding years, he's raiding settlements alongside the east coast of Mexico. He is forcibly kidnapping Native people there. We don't know if those Native people are already enslaved or if he enslaves them, but he forces them to relocate here and he sells them into enslavement. We don't know, however, whether Betty was taken from another colony through a raid like that or whether Betty was taken directly from her homeland, because we also have documents from 10 years after Betty sold that tell us that James Barré was present in Madagascar purchasing enslaved African people to bring them here to New York. And so we have a bit of contextual information, but nothing about Betty's specific circumstances. But I do want to speculate a little bit more. On the left side here, you can see an image of one of the cellar living quarters in one of the houses on Huguenot Street that survives. This has been restored, so many of the materials there aren't original. And I'll point out some specific aspects. The floorboards there, those are quite new, and there were not floorboards there originally. These were dirt floors. Likely, anytime it rained, those floors would have become damp. They possibly would have become muddy, and that's something that Sojourner of Truth talks about in her own narrative here. There are a number of large windows right in back of where I'm standing in that photo. There's also a lamp that would not have been there, of course. It was just that small, almost like a skylight in the upper wall in the back right of the room. Sojourner of Truth in her narrative talks about growing up in a cellar living quarters that had that same window and says it felt like the sun never shined through it. And she said if it rained, it was mud. She said it was freezing in the wintertime, it was sweltering in the summertime. I can stand up straight in this one, and most of the cellar living quarters on Huguenot Street, I can't stand up straight in them. And this is not just awful conditions in terms of living, but I mean, think about the era of surveillance as well. Here in Dutch New York, believe it or not, at times you would have a higher rate of enslavers than you would have down south. A wider cross-section of the European population would own slaves here than down south, but they would own fewer slaves per person. And that means oftentimes enslaved people are not living in groups of hundreds of people on large plantations in separate buildings. They're living in just as awful conditions, being dehumanized and mistreated just as much as down south, but they're living most often in these cellar spaces beneath the homes of the people that enslaved them. There's an air of surveillance inherent to enslavement here. There's also family separation inherent to enslavement here. If each enslaver only enslaves 1 to 3 people, how often is an enslaved family going to be limited to 3 people? Statistically, that means most enslaved families here are being separated, and that's likely what happened to both Jack and Betty. You can see from the objects in that room just how much work she would have been doing, and we can think in one sense how hard that work would have been, right? We've probably all sat next to a campfire. We probably all felt the smell of smoke in our nostrils and felt that singe. Think about that feeling, and imagine cooking over an open hearth fire 3 times a day for a family of 9 people that aren't paying you, right, in the sweltering summer heat. But I think it's important we don't only talk about how difficult this work would have been, but we talk about how this would have been the most skilled work, and enslaved people like Betty and Jack would have been the most skilled workers. I mean, think about the skills, knowledge, and practice you have to be able to cook. Think about the skills and knowledge you have to be able to make clothes. And there are items used for clothes making that are just cut off in this view on the right side of the screen. And so I think it's important we think about the impact in terms of the skilled labor these individuals are conducting as well. And on the right, we have an image of an attic living space in another home on Huguenot Street. That's in the Jean Hasbrook house. And that's a room that we believe also housed enslaved individuals. It would have housed about 4 individuals. It was locked from the outside. There's no window in that room. But there is a small semblance of personal possessions, as you can see from that chest. And it's important I mention that as well. We don't know, possibly the most humanizing details about Jack and Betty. Things like whether they would have played any instruments. What music did they like? What games did they like to play? What did they do for recreation? And very, very seldom do we get windows into those human aspects of enslaved people here. But I think it's important we all consider those possibilities about Jack and Betty for a moment. And I imagine I'm probably pretty over on time, so I'm just going to show one more image. I always like to show this, just to give a sense of what the physical labor inherent to founding a new community here would have been like. We take for granted how many trees exist in the area today, and many of you likely know this, but there's maybe 50 acres of old growth forest left in Ulster County. Almost the entirety of the county was clear cut at one point or another. Imagine the scale of labor it would have taken to clear that stretch of land in the right side of this image here. And I have one last story I want to tell. This is a Lantantillo painting showing you what the community would have looked like probably towards the end of Jack and Betty's lives in the 1720s as the first stone houses on Huguenot Street are being constructed. But I want to tell one last story quickly. So I mentioned earlier the Deyo house was renovated into a Victorian mansion in the 1890s. When that was being done, Historic Huguenot Street had actually just been founded. Believe it or not, one of the founders of the museum was the one who destroyed that stone house and did that renovation, but that's a story for another time. As that renovation's taking place, human remains were found outside the home. And they were donated to the Historical Society there. And Historic Huguenot Street, then called the Huguenot, I'm going to get the order of these terms wrong, so forgive me, but something akin to the Huguenot Patriotic, Historical, and Monumental Society. They put the bones in a display case in the front room of the stone house they had purchased as a museum, and they labeled them Indian skull. And it wasn't for some 50 years that those remains were taken out of display and were put into collection storage, that being then considered insensitive in the mid-20th century. But they still weren't treated respectfully, still no investigation was done into who these remains were. And it wasn't until the early 21st century that these remains were brought back to the forefront again, and they were sent to the forensic anthropologist, the bioarchaeologist at SUNY New Paltz, a man named Ken Nystrom, who himself has had a monumental impact on expanding our knowledge of enslaved people in this region. And Ken Nystrom found, based on the teeth actually, that individual was not a native person. It was an African man who died sometime around the year 1700, and he was somewhere between the age of 25 and 50. We don't know, and we can't say certainly that those remains were Jack's. But Jack is the only candidate we know of for who those remains were. And Jack lived in that very house where those remains were found, and every possibility Jack would have passed away in 1700. But at that point, they hadn't done research, we hadn't been talking about Jack and teaching about him. And so these remains were assumed to be unidentifiable. And they were reburied, not in the African burying ground on Huguenot Street, which is maybe a half mile up from the museum today. They were reburied in the old Huguenot burying ground, the European colonial burial ground at the museum. Every possibility integrating that burial ground for the first time. And in the absence of a name, you can see the stone that was chosen there in the middle. The word Sankofa was chosen. And it's a symbol that you'll see a different representation of on the statue of Sojourner Truth over there. It comes from a Ghanaian people called the Akan people. It comes from a system they had called the Adinkra. And the Adinkra is a system that uses symbols and short proverbs to teach really abstract concepts. The example that someone said to me one time was, imagine you had to teach a kindergartner what sarcasm was, right? And imagine now, if you had an image and a small proverb that you could use to teach that, how much easier that would be. So Sankofa is the Adinkra word for learning from painful parts of your past. The exact translation is go back and get it. This is a bit more eloquent translation chosen on the stone. It is not wrong to go back for that which you have forgotten. And that word emphasizes learning from painful aspects of the past, even if you've avoided doing that to this point. And it's a symbol we know enslaved people in New York were using, and that there was a coffin found in Manhattan's African burial ground that had that exact same symbol marked on it with nails. So we can't say for certain, but there's every possibility that those remains were Jack's, and that finally in 2013, Jack was given a respectful burial. And I encourage you guys, I ask you guys, the next time you're in New Paltz to stop by Huguenot Street, not just to visit the witness stones for Jack and Betty, but especially to visit the old Huguenot burying ground and to pay respects to Jack and to the enslaved people of New Paltz in general at that stone. And so I want to thank the Walkway for this opportunity. I want to thank you guys from the bottom of my heart. I know there's all manner of things you could be doing on a beautiful Sunday afternoon, right? And it gives me great hope and great joy to know that you guys decided to come here and join in this conversation and decided to, help as we try and restore honor to Jack and Betty's impact and legacy. And I'm happy to take as many questions as people have. I am out of business cards at the moment, so I apologize. But my email is up there on the screen. It's cut off a little bit. So actually, I'm going to encourage you not to use that exact email address. If you look up Ulster County Historian, my email will pop right up, and I'm happy to take any questions you have about anything related to Ulster County's history through email, but I'm happy to take as many questions as people have about this presentation today too. And I just want to say thank you all again. Okay, wonderful. Thank you for that. Let's run it way back. And yeah, does anyone have any questions?
Sir. I think I want to get straight. I think I heard you say that there were more instances of slavery actually in north than in the south.
Yeah.
Now, people in the south, there tend to be less people, but they tended to have 50, 100 slaves.
Exactly.
Whereas everybody up here, or a lot of people, it was fashionable to have one or two households slaves to, so you might have had it more prevalent, although the numbers are lower, the prevalence was higher.
Exactly, and I find that many people today in this area still don't know that. In 1800, in the U.S. federal census, the second one taken in 1800, there are more slave owners in the state of New York than there were slave owners in the states of Virginia or Georgia. Just to consider that for a moment. Less enslaved people, but more enslavers, more slave owners. And for a town like New Paltz, as I mentioned, in 1800, 15% of the town was enslaved Africans. For towns like Hurley and Marbletown, that number was 25% or higher were enslaved African peoples. And it's why I think we as Americans need to do a better job of talking about enslavement as a nationwide phenomenon. Enslavement doesn't fully end in New York until 13 years before the start of the Civil War. And I always use that as an example. If you were born on the day the last enslaved person in New York was freed in 1848, and you tried to join the Union Army at the start of the Civil War, you wouldn't be old enough to fight. Think about that for a moment. And I think in some ways, the South obviously would probably profoundly disagree with me on how much enslavement plays a role in structural, inequality today. But a phenomenon I experienced at times at Huguenot Street was if I had two bus groups, one of them of white senior citizens from Alabama and one of them white senior citizens from Albany, the group from Alabama were probably going to ask very, very thoughtful and intentional questions about the enslaved people on the site. And the group from Albany was going to fight me tooth and nail on whether there were slaves here, and if they were here, they were going to tell me they were treated way better. And so I so appreciate you making that point, because it's something I think we still gotta get the word out on. So thank you, sir. Does anyone else have any other questions?
The first couple you mentioned, Anthony and how were they able to self-emancipate without being hunted by a slave?
That's a great question. All right, the really long and complex story short. Anthony and Suzanne are brought here by an English slave owner, plantation owner, a very wealthy kind of English nobleman, who expands his business interests from Barbados here right when the English take over the colony. The Dutch briefly retake the colony for maybe 6 months in 1673. And when they do that, they look at most of the people here and think, well, they've lived under both governments. We're going to leave everyone be. But they look at people like the Morris family, who founds Morrisania in the Bronx, and they say, well, they only came here after the English took over, and they work for the English government. People like that were going to take their property. And the Dutch seized the property of the Morris family on Morrisania in the Bronx, including Anthony and Susanna, who were brought here by the Morris family. They are then brought up to Kingston. They're sold at public auction for the financial benefit of the Dutch government. They're bought by Louis Du Bois. They spend maybe a year with him before they self-emancipate. They cross the Hudson River, we don't know how. They meet Wappinger's native people on the east side of the Hudson River, and they manage to return, they choose to return back to Morrisania. And when they get there, they're incarcerated, they're what's the word, detained by the Morris family, and they're re-enslaved there. And that sets off an 8-year legal battle in public courts between Lewis Morris and Louis Du Bois over who owned Anthony and Susanna. And we know their story in exceptional detail compared to most enslaved people because of that court case. And Louis Du Bois ends up losing the court case on appeal. And so Anthony and Susanna never returned. Now, we don't know why they go back to Morrisania. My guess would be that probably family. They had been separated from there. But yeah, great question. And I believe, so on YouTube, there's a recorded presentation going through that story in full that I gave for the Bronx Historical Society a number of years ago. So if you go on the Bronx Historical Society's YouTube page, there's a full presentation about Anthony and Susanna there. And I'm working on a book. Lord knows when it'll come out. I keep finding new things. But hopefully one day there'll be a book out about them as well. Yeah.
Again, going back to the point, like the difference between slavery in Albany, New York, and Albany, Georgia.
Yeah.
The comparison of the two. Do you, in your opinion, is there any credence to the theory that because of the lower number of slaves per capita, they did not need to develop vicious systems of mass control? Ooh. And that was the difference of slavery. So northern slavery was still slavery, still owning a human, but it was more of the attitude like had always been going on throughout history. Whereas in the South, in Georgia, they had to devise methods of controlling 50 and 100 at a time.
I think there were more methods of control, I think, that existed here than we might expect. A black person here didn't have the right to navigate the public space. They had to have a pass either attesting to their freedom or a pass attesting to their permission to be moving around in public from their enslaver. And any white individual during times of enslavement could demand that pass of that enslaved person. On Huguenot Street, one of the most viscerally painful objects they had in their collection is a collar that was passed down through a white family in New Paltz, and it has the name Elias Hardenberg on the collar, the name of the slave owner, and that would have been forced around the neck of an enslaved woman who had tried to escape and was returned to the community. So I think in a lot of ways, I think it was just as repressive. I think it was just as inhumane in both places. I think one of the maybe unexpected differences is that there's less of that air of surveillance at times on plantations in the South, believe it or not. I mean, if you have hundreds of enslaved people enslaved over generations on the same plantation, you have a community that develops there. You know, they're living in separate buildings in inhumane conditions, but, right, like they have their own religious structures that develop there, their own cultural structures, like, right, marriage systems that they develop themselves there. They are living in a community. And being in a separate building at the very least, I mean, there's differences in the surveillance and the proximity between the two. Sometimes I think about what it would be like just to hear the footsteps of the enslavers up above you each day. And so I think there was maybe an element of cultural isolation here at times that we don't always see down south. But I think in a lot of ways, I think they're more similar than we might expect, yeah. Please, yeah.
That's a great question.
And the second is, you mentioned the Wallkill
Yeah. Yeah.
What was that relationship like?
Oh, yeah.
Both. Thank you for both questions, and they're fantastic questions. Under the Dutch, enslavement it's a different system here. It actually is not fully chattel enslavement under the Dutch, and that enslaved people under the Dutch system were not fully legally reduced to the status of objects. Dutch enslaved people still had rights to appear in court and had standing in court. Dutch enslaved people actually had a recognized right to a degree of input on the status of their children and on who their children would be sold to. After a certain amount of service, we see enslaved individuals under Dutch governance sue for their freedom, actually. And I would have been remiss not to mention this, so I'm very thankful you brought this up. Because the system of enslavement as we conceptualize it, the Dutch introduce it here, but it's the English that remake that system into what we know of it as today, racialized chattel enslavement. So I really appreciate you asking that. Native people, most often, there's a level of solidarity between them, but not always. Actually, the first record of an enslaved person in Ulster County's history, in the Hudson Valley's history, the mid-Hudson Valley, is from the Second Esopus War between the Dutch and the Esopus, and it's from a casualty list. And one of the casualties lost in an attack on Kingston, one of the people killed, is an enslaved man owned by the founder of Kingston, Thomas Chambers. The document doesn't mention his name, but it tells us the founder of Kingston had an enslaved man. Which means that likely he, the day a European stepped foot in Kingston with the intent to live there the first time, there was a black man next to him. But it also tells us, right, that it wasn't always solidarity, right? In that attack, there's an enslaved man killed by Native people, but usually it was. My favorite example of this locally is there's a document in the New York State Archives written by the Ulster County government in 1712, I want to say, but I could have that off by a year or two. But it's a complaint from the government of Ulster County to the English governor about how often, in recent decades at that point, enslaved people, especially enslaved men, had been self-emancipating, and that they were being welcomed into and were marrying into the Minisink group of Lenape people, the Munsee people, down in the kind of Port Jervis area. And they say they were reminded of this issue and brought it up to the English governor at that point because a week before, an enslaved man owned by Louis Bevere on Huguenot Street in New Paltz had self-emancipated and married into the Minisink tribe. So oftentimes solidarity, but not always. During the American Revolution and a couple other times in the 17th and 18th centuries, Native people are actually in the period of alliance between the Native people and the Europeans here. They're contracted to pursue self-emancipated enslaved people. Sometimes the same person who's welcoming an escaped slave person into their community and marrying in is also contracted at a different point to go and pursue enslaved people. So it's complex. But oftentimes it was solidarity. Those are both fantastic questions.
Yeah.
So, I know the founders of New Paltz were the Huguenots. They're a religious community leaving Europe for religious persecution. Is there any record of how religion was kind of utilized in relation to enslaved people? Like, used in the South.
Enslaved people, there's one exception where Louis Du Bois's wife actually, in her will, requires that her enslaved people, after she requires that she has them baptized in the church, and I imagine she would have gotten pushback for that. And she, in her will, requires that they're given their freedom eventually and that they're treated as full members of the church. It doesn't end up happening. Her second husband goes back on that after she dies. But that's the exception to the rule. So at times they're active in the communities and they're practicing the same religion, but usually they wouldn't be given access to the religious communities around here. And so in the case of Sojourner Truth gives us some insight into how elements of Christianity are introduced to them, but it really kind of develops on its own among enslaved communities here. But there are exceptions. Anthony and Susanna's names are a strong indicator of where they might have come from. And that you'll notice what's the way to say this? Anthony and Susanna are both generally Catholic names in the 17th and 16th centuries. And believe it or not, Catholicism, due to missionary work and colonization by the Portuguese and the Spanish, Catholicism had spread pretty widely in northern Africa and northwest Africa by this period. So there's a fair chance, just based on Anthony and Susanna's names, because you wouldn't get a Calvinist family here, a Huguenot, naming someone Anthony or Susanna. That would have been kind of taboo for that time period. That's a Catholic name. They tend to have Old Testament names like Ezekiel and Isaac and Daniel and Abraham and so on. So possibly they were Catholics, but usually they wouldn't be given full access to the religion here. One thing though that I'll mention as well, thank you, Janse. One thing I'll mention is that I wonder sometimes what Louis Du Bois would have thought about enslavement when he first arrived here. Right? He's a refugee. He's a refugee who grows up amid warfare in Belgium. He leaves his home as a child with his parents to flee to Germany. He grows up as a refugee in Germany, then has to flee there due to a war. He gets here to Kingston and he arrives just in time for a war between the Native Americans and the Dutch to break out here. And his wife and children are taken captive in that war for months. He experiences something like 4 different wars that forced him to leave his home at different points in his life. And sometimes I wonder if there isn't a reason why he arrives in 1660 and doesn't purchase enslaved people until Anthony and Susanna in 1673, 10 years after that second war. Sometimes I wonder if maybe it's a kind of product of conditioning here. as he comes here and becomes a part of the kind of gentry here over 10 years, maybe eventually by the end of that, he can, wrap his mind around treating someone this way and denying them their humanity. Sometimes I wonder if he wouldn't have felt differently when he was first coming from Europe as a refugee. So I don't know the answer, but I think it's a really good question, and it's one that I think a lot of us wonder about often. Yeah, of course, great question. Is anyone else? Any else?
Will you come back?
Oh, I'd love to.
Absolutely, yeah. And so just recently we did carry this project forward one more year. We researched the first 4 enslaved individuals on record in the Jean Hasbrook house on Huguenot Street. And so I gave a talk for them recently, but I believe there's a recording of that talk out there somewhere, but I'd love to come back and to give that talk here as well. Their names were Garrett, Molly, Hendrik, and James, and they have a fascinating story of their own right. So I'd love to be back. I'd love to be back to present about any topic as well. And that goes for each and all of you. I'm always careful to mention this at the end of my talks. I work for you. I'm blessed to be the first full-time historian we've had in our county's history. Take advantage of that. Thank you. I appreciate it. But please take advantage of that. If you have a question about your house, about your family's history, a question about the stone wall you've driven past every day on your way to work for the last 13 years, email me, ask about it, and I'd love to help. I'd love to be back as well. So I'll just say thank you all one more time. I really appreciate it.